Now, at this time, I'd like to set the stage for our Marketplace keynote series by introducing our next general session speaker. Andy Koblenz is going to continue the conversation about disruption in the auto industry from the franchise new car dealer perspective. We appreciate the work that Andy and his team at NIADA do to protect the interest of the dealer community. He's a dear friend and a great advocate. And Andy is the Executive Vice President of Legal and Regulatory Affairs, which represents NADA and dealer interest before federal agencies. Andy's credentials are impeccable, and his knowledge of all things automotive is vast, and we won't hold it against him that he's a cum laude graduate of Harvard Law School. So please join me in welcoming to the stage our next speaker, Andy Koblenz.
Thanks, Steve, and welcome to everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here. I just want to give a shout out and echo a lot of what Steve said. We really at NADA have a great working relationship with NIADA, with Steve and Sean and the whole team. We appreciate the support. We hope we give support back, and we are very pleased to be here today to talk to you a little bit about looking down the road, as Steve was saying, at what's going on in the auto industry, not just in the next 2-3 years, but 5 years, 10 years, 15 or 20 years, and whether or not there's as much disruption as that you hear. So with that, let me get into it. You really can't go to a conference these days, an auto conference, and not hear the hype. You don't hear, there's a lot of change afoot, that's absolutely true, but how much of what you hear about is hype? How much is the world changing with electric vehicles and driverless cars and things like that? And you hear a lot of voices at these conferences. You hear from the OEMs. You hear from Silicon Valley. You hear from Wall Street. You hear from the government. You hear from think tanks. You hear from the media. You hear from consultants. But what's the one voice you don't hear from in that list? Well, that voice is the consumer. And we believe that when you start listening to consumers, you get a slightly different picture of the future of the auto industry, not only in the next 2 or 3 years, but further down the road. So what we like to do is look at the issues of the day through the lens of the consumer perspective. Now, you hear a lot about 4 converging technologies and 4 converging trends going on. Autonomous or driverless vehicles, connected cars, hailed cars. Usually you see people put up rideshare. Rideshare is not the right term. Rideshare is carpooling. We're talking about ride-hailing, things like Lyft and Uber, and electric. And the theory is when those things come together, they're going to completely change the way that the auto industry looks. So what I want to do is go through these in ascending order of disruption, starting with electric vehicles, then turning to driverless cars or AVs, and finally turning to the impact of ride-hailing and see what the future looks like. I hope that this is beneficial to you because these are the cars that you'll be selling or hopefully selling as we go forward, and I think that you'll find some interesting maybe counter-narratives as I go through this. So let's first turn to electric vehicles. There is a ton of investment going on in electric. Lots of government activity, both abroad in China and Europe and here. Lots of new models coming, the i3, the Focus, the Leaf, all the Teslas, the Bolt, and many, many more. Everybody has one now. But the consumer uptake of electric vehicles is, while wildly increasing as a percentage, remains minuscule in absolute numbers. Let me give you a couple statistics. In 2018, nationally, electric vehicles represented 1.2% of new vehicle sales. In California, where they made all the investments in infrastructure and all the incentives, that number was only 4.1%. But also, let's go a little deeper into the data. If you look at the cohorts of people buying electric vehicles, plug-in hybrids, and conventional hybrids, those 3 cohorts, while the portion of that is represented by electric vehicles has been growing tremendously, the other 2 are shrinking, so that the total of the 3 cohorts is remaining about flat at about 10%, 10 or 11%. What that tells us is that the environmentally conscious buyer is purchasing the electric vehicle, but the standard normal person who's not buying for environmental reasons still hasn't taken over. And finally, one last piece of data. Strategic Vision does a study of what people do when they dispose of their vehicles. So what are electric vehicle owners buying when they dispose of their electric vehicles? Well, 46% of them are not buying another electric vehicle. And 31% are buying an internal combustion. More than 3/4 of those people who aren't buying an electric vehicle are buying an internal combustion engine. What that is telling us is that when they try out, some people say just try out the electric vehicle and you'll fall in love with it. Well, a lot of people aren't. The question is why? And we think the short answer is, again, listen to the consumer. Pay attention to their needs and wants. First of all, it's not cost. Steve mentioned that the cost of a new vehicle is now about $34,000. It's actually a little higher, $36,000. There's $37,000, and that's about the same price as the cost of a new electric vehicle. So it's not cost. It's not even range. Electric vehicles are now getting 250, 300 miles per charge. We believe that what's going on is that the refueling challenges of electric vehicles aren't meeting the needs and wants of consumers. A huge percentage, maybe upwards of a third of the people in this country, don't park in the same place every night. My daughter lives on 16th Street in Washington. She has a car. She parks in the street. She can't have an electric vehicle because there's not charging stations all up along our street and 16th Street in Washington. There are only 16,000 chargers out there. More will come when demand is there, but there's 160,000 gas stations, and those have up to 10 or 12 pumps at each one. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, is the speed of recharging. Currently takes on the best, it takes about an hour to recharge a vehicle. Now, I don't know about you, but if I'm going up to a gas station and I see a person refueling and a person waiting, that's about 6 or 7 minutes of waiting. I just go to the next gas station. If you see that with an electric vehicle, you could be there for an hour to an hour and a half. So we don't believe that we're meeting the needs and wants of consumers. There's also concern about battery life, and you guys would know this best. What happens 5, 6, 7 years after that car has been out on the road? How much degradation is in their battery? Well, you're going to have to replace a part of the car that costs a third of the price of it. So until we solve those refueling and battery life challenges and clarify residual values and used car prices and the needs and wants of the consumers, we don't see the uptake growing. When those problems are solved, we do think that there'll be a big uptake in an electric vehicle. But the predictions that we're going to be selling nothing other than electric vehicles on the new side, and you'll be seeing mostly electric vehicles on the used side coming off that in the next 5 to 7 years, we just think is way too aggressive, and we think it's going to be a slower uptake. But it will come, and we'll have time to adjust. So let me turn now to the second. You've heard about this. Driverless cars are coming. Autonomous vehicles are coming. And they are. But at what pace? Are they nearly here? You've heard reports. Ford said it's going to have AVs out by 2022. Remember to get the right definition of what an AV is. Not something that has a very small geofenced area like it can go around the campus at the University of Michigan or something. We're talking about the broad application of driverless cars in the driveways and moving people around all over the country. You've also heard the argument as to why they're coming so quickly. It's a compelling argument. 37,000 people a year die on the roads, and 94% of those crashes are the result of bad behavior by a human. This is unacceptable, the argument goes, and it sounds compelling. 37,000 deaths is a tragedy and is unacceptable. But let's unpack the two sides of this argument. The argument says, first, humans are lousy drivers. They're the ones causing these 37,000 deaths. And secondly, the computers that are going to be involved in driverless cars are better and can do the job better. And I want to look at those two separately and understand if those are both as valid as they say. First, are humans that bad? Contrary to conventional wisdom, humans are phenomenally good drivers. Let me ask a question. How many vehicle miles per death do you think there are in the United States? Any guesses? 500,000? 1 million? 5 million? Well, the answer to that question, the number of vehicle miles traveled per death in the United States is 90 million miles. That's an awful lot of good driving. Yes, those 30,000 deaths are caused by bad human behavior, but it's like the kid who's taking a math test who gets a 98. They got the two questions wrong. They should have gotten them right, but they got an A on the test. Humans are very, very good drivers. We do a phenomenal amount of good driving. We're sentient people, and we can understand and translate information well. And all around this country, there are cars right now zipping along and not having crashes and not having accidents. We're very good at that. And that's with today's technology. As new advanced driver assist technologies get introduced, we're going to get even better as humans. This is a quotation from NHTSA's V2V rulemaking a couple years ago, where the agency estimated that 4 level 2 driver assist technologies could address 89% of light-duty to light-duty crashes. We're not talking about driverless cars here. We're talking about things like lane departure control, automatic braking, not just adaptive cruise control, but automatic braking, things like connected vehicle to the world so that your car starts to see around the corner and alert the driver that there's a scooter coming down, something that Ford is just releasing right now. This is technology that's not coming in 10 years or 20 years or 30 years. This is technology that's coming today and is on the new cars that are being produced today and will be on the cars that you guys will be selling in very short order. And soon we anticipate that deaths on the roads will start to drop. And when that happens, the imperative to go to driverless vehicles for safety reasons will tend to dissipate. And with that political wind dissipates, we think that the pressure to go to autonomous vehicles will dissipate as well. And we're not the only ones saying this. AAA did a study that revealed that 9 million deaths on the roads could be eliminated if drivers only utilize the technology that is there today, not tomorrow, but today, if they didn't turn it off and use it properly. So we all have an education challenge ahead of us, but we can use today's technology to improve it. And Gil Pratt, who is the head of Toyota Research Institute, which is the Toyota Autonomous Vehicles Research arm, has said that safety is not a reason for us to move to driverless cars. We should be seeking to use technology to improve human driving. That's the path to optimal safety, not driverless cars. So it's far from clear that humans are lousy drivers. But there's a second half of the equation that I set up, and that is, how good are the computers? Well, you know, we still don't know. The jury is out. Derek Kahn, who's number 3 at the Department of Transportation, he used to work at Lyft, said that the current assessments, how many times the human has to intervene, is not a very good assessment of how good a driverless car is. And in a very interesting and very significant regulatory development, General Motors has petitioned the NHTSA for the permission to sell truly driverless vehicles, no steering wheel, no brake pedal, to the public. And they need permission from NHTSA to do it, and they've submitted a petition. And NHTSA just last month issued 2 months ago in March, put it out to the public for comment and asked a bunch of questions to the public. And there was one question that they asked that I think is very important to see. It was question 5, and it's that middle sentence. The first question they say is, what studies, data, assumptions, scientific reasoning, methodologies are needed for the agency, NHTSA, to evaluate and compare the ZAV, that's the car, and another vehicle that's compliant with existing regulations? But here's the key question. Should the agency assess whether an ADS, that's an automated driving system, steers, brakes, and accelerates at least as effectively and as safely as the average human? Who gives the car its driver's test? NHTSA is asking that question. I believe the answer to that question is going to be yes. And then the next question it's asked is, if so, what methodology should NHTSA use to do it? And I will tell you that is a very big challenge. How do you write a test for a computer? You can't just lay out 15 or 20 maneuvers that the computer needs to do, because that's easy. They'll program the computer to do those 15. We have to come up with a test that is going to replicate the billions, literally billions of situations that humans are able to navigate on a daily basis. That's going to be hard. Not impossible, but it's going to be hard to do, and it's going to take some time. Why do I say all this? Because as safety goes down, it's also going to be very hard to come up with the test for the cars to pass, and I think from a regulatory perspective, that's going to slow the advent of driverless vehicles as they enter into the marketplace. So ultimately, what is needed to address the consumer concerns with AVs? First, we talked a lot about safety. We're going to need to satisfy that we are replacing a really good driver with a better driver in the form of the computer, and that's going to take some time. Secondly, not to give it short shrift, consumers are going to be concerned about privacy in those cars. What kind of data is being collected, and who gets it, and who's able to buy it, where is it being used, and who's getting paid for it? And those issues are unresolved, and as privacy developments go through the California legislature and the federal legislature, I think we'll see some more impediments to the rapid deployment of AVs, of driverless vehicles, as we go forward. And then finally, and maybe the biggest one, you could get safety perfectly right and you can get privacy perfectly right, but if you don't have a cyber-secure vehicle that is not susceptible to hacking, those two things are not going to be much comfort. They could be completely undermined. It undergirds both of those. The bottom line is AVs, driverless cars, will arrive, but in our estimation, they're going to arrive much more slowly than a lot of people are saying. And the last thing I'll say on this topic is watch for an exogenous event. Look at what happened with the Boeing 737 MAX crash. That's being attributed in part to the autonomous operation of that airplane. Exogenous events have a way of truly slowing things down. So we think that while they're coming, the timeline is much more attenuated. Bob Carter, at a forum in New York, he's the number 2 at Toyota, said he doesn't see commercialization of driverless vehicles until the 2050 timeframe, and even then, I don't think he's talking about having them in everybody's driveway. So I think the timeline is much slower than a lot of people are saying. And that brings me to the third issue, which is probably, from an existential perspective, the most important one for anyone who's a dealer. Will autonomous vehicles, will driverless vehicles combine with ride-hailing, with these type of services that Uber and Lyft provide, to change the way Americans get their ground transportation? You've heard this one. Once AVs get here, they will combine with ride-hailing to shift the ownership model. We will have mobility as a service, just like air travel. I don't own an airplane. When I came here from Washington yesterday, I bought a seat on an airplane. People are saying that that's the way we're going to get our ground transportation. There'll be these big fleets of cars, and we'll have an app on our phone, and we'll call up a car, and it'll come and zip up and pick us up. We'll get in it, and then we're not going to own our own cars. We're not going to have to worry about maintenance. We're not going to have to worry about parking. And that's the way the world is going to be once we get the driver out of those ride-hailed vehicles or those taxis. But is this true? Who's saying this? And more importantly, as I said at the outset, who's not saying it? Well, let's take a look. So the first person who's saying it is this guy. This is Adam Jonas. He is with Morgan Stanley. He's on Wall Street. And this is a quote from him. "Your car is arguably one of the most underutilized, polluting, time-consuming, and dangerous machines on Earth. We have invested a capital base equal to $20 trillion sitting on the side of the road, in the driveway, in a parking deck, at a car dealer, just waiting, rusting, leaking fluids." He also says that cars are only utilized 4% of the time, and the economics are compelling. We are going to need if we could get those cars out there 30, 40, 50, 60% of the time, we could drive the price of driving a mile down so low that people would just give up their cars, and it'll be so cheap that they will no longer own cars. And it's not just Wall Street that's saying it. This is McKinsey, a fairly reputable consulting firm. 1 out of 10 cars sold in 2030 will be a shared vehicle. 10% will be dedicated to the shared market. Boston Consulting Group, another reputable firm. The next car you own may be your last, meaning that you're not going to own cars after you buy your next one. And then finally, I don't know if you saw this one. Now, this one's a little over the top. This is RethinkX. They said that by 2030, 95% of miles traveled, not cars sold, 95% of miles traveled will be in a driverless EV that is a ride-hail or a shared car. I don't get the math. You know, most of the cars that are going to be on the road in 2030 already are on the road. The cars last 12, 13 years. But that's what they said. So I think this one's a little over the top, but people are saying it. So the question comes, are they right? Now, the first thing is it true that they're going to be cheaper? MIT studied it, and they found that even with robots behind the wheel, ride-hailing is still going to be more expensive than conventional ownership on a per-mile basis. I'm not sure they're right about that, and I want to assume that they're wrong, but there's a substantial question as to whether or not we're even going to be cheaper. But even if it's cheaper to get your transportation from a ride-hailing situation, is it going to happen? What voice is missing? The consumer. So as Steve alluded to, we actually went out and talked to consumers about their attitudes. And we didn't rely on theories. We actually talked to actual consumers, and we oversampled millennials because a lot of people are talking about that millennials are going to be less interested in car ownership. So let's see what we found. The top line finding was that people have very little interest in giving up their cars in favor of exclusively ride-hailing. They like it as a supplement, they like it as a complement, but not as a substitute. They want both. And this was true even after we made the best arguments in favor of ride-hailing, convenience, safety, money, all those kinds of things. They still wanted their own cars. It was 1 in 10 for everybody, 1 in 20 for millennials, but when you drill down into the millennials, it was millennials who were not yet married and had not yet started forming families. And just a quick note on millennials, every bit of evidence is out there that there's no difference between the millennial generation and all their predecessor cohorts. They're getting married, buying cars, having kids, moving to the suburbs, getting licenses, all those traditional rites of passage at the same rate of prior generations with one big exception. They're doing it about 5 years later in life than their predecessor generations, and that's largely attributable to the Great Recession of the 2008 to 2009 timeframe, where they got a little stagnant in their incomes. But overall, millennials are doing the same. The Federal Reserve Board of the United States did a major study on this and concluded that there's no evidence that millennial buying habits are any different from anyone else. We're also not reurbanizing. There's a lot of strike. Everybody's moving back into the cities. Well, actually, suburbs are growing at a faster rate than our urban centers are in 19 out of the 20 largest urban centers in this country. So when we asked them this question, they all said they wanted to keep it. So we went one step deeper and said, why do you want, is that? And they gave us a lot of answers, but one stood out. It went to that question that Adam Jodas said. He said, remember what he said? 4% utilization. People only use their cars 4% of the time. And when we asked consumers that, they didn't understand the question. Over 90% said that every moment their cars provide value in the form of independence, freedom, and flexibility to go where they want, when they need to. This flexibility has value to consumers. Or in other words, they were using their cars more than just when the cars were in motion. People use their cars as big purses. One person has described it. We live in 3 spaces in our lives. We live in our homes, we live where we work, and we live in our cars. It's a sanctuary of personal space, and people like having the reliability of knowing that their car's there. My car is currently at the airport in Washington, D.C. It's got stuff in it that I need when I get off the plane tomorrow where I'm going and I'm not going to my house. I didn't want to bring all that stuff with me to Las Vegas in my suitcase. I left it in my car. I'm using my car even as we speak. It's not moving. People use their cars a lot more important. They don't view their car as utilitarian. If people viewed their cars as a utilitarian device, we wouldn't have BMWs and Lexuses. Everybody would be driving a 5-year-old Camry or a 5-year-old Accord. Basically, what they all said is, why would I want to give up my car when I could just keep my car and ride share? This quote, it was an actual quote from one of our focus group. It summed it up. And people on Wall Street are starting to listen to this as well. Let me just read you one of the new IPOs. This was a Wall Street analyst view. In order to justify its current market valuation, investors need to take a big leap of faith that millennials and later generations will forego ownership of a car and opt instead for reliance on ride-sharing service. Despite the optics of vehicles being an underutilized asset, we believe people will continue to own their vehicles as primary transportation and instead rely on the ride-sharing services as a convenient supplement. So the people on Wall Street are starting to get the point as well. So consumers have no interest in shifting the model of ownership on their own, and they gave us some very good reasons why. Thus, market forces probably won't lead to a shift in the ownership model. But there are those who are pushing for it, notwithstanding the absence of a consumer pull. This is a statement that Lyft and Uber signed on to about 2 years ago. And this is not a prediction of what's going to happen. This is a statement of their position. And let me pull out the key statement. They were talking about in urban areas, it is critical that all AVs are part of shared fleets. They don't want private ownership of cars. They don't want us, my members and you guys, to be selling cars to individuals. They want them all to be going to fleets. And if you don't believe me there, this is from the Wall Street Journal. Lyft's co-founder wants to end car ownership. That's his goal. It's a business model. That's what this is. This is a business model that some people are promoting. So the question then becomes, if there's no consumer pull, how can they get it done? And the answer is, and why you need NIADA and why our members need NIADA and all the state affiliates, it's the government that could do this. The government could put their finger on this issue through taxes, through things like driving restrictions, through the elimination of parking in favor of places to do ride-hailing. So, if you don't believe me that this is a part of the game plan, I want you to watch a clip I have of a news report from Washington, D.C., and I want you to pay careful attention to who's talking to whom here.
News 4 at 4 starts now.
Parking spots are hot commodities. Now there could be fewer of them.
Why they could soon be used to make room for more ride-sharing services. Ride-sharing services like Uber and Lyft are more popular than ever these days, and now their popularity could make it harder for you to find parking all over D.C.
You know how hard that is already. Uber CEO Dara Khosrowshahi spoke alongside Mayor Muriel Bowser yesterday. They discussed setting up more designated pickup and drop-off spots across the city. Khosrowshahi says ride-sharing is the future of public transportation, even if it still doesn't feel normal to everyone quite yet.
So I know what you're all thinking, that, okay, so he's trying, but come on, the government of the District of Columbia and other local governments around the world, around the country, aren't going to buy into that. They're not going to start putting their thumb on the scale and make this a self-fulfilling prophecy. Well, that's a nice hope, but I want you to watch another video, and this is literally from about 14 months after the first video. Watch what this news report says.
News 4 Today starts now.
First on News 4, D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser wants to redesign a major downtown street.
The mayor wants to take away the service roads on both sides of K Street between 12th and 21st and Northwest. Most of the metered parking would be eliminated too. So here's what the stretch of road would look like instead of the service road and street parking. There will be drop-off and pickup zones for ride sharing. Buses will be given their own dedicated lanes down the center of K Street. This project will cost about $120 million and take about 4 years to complete if it's approved by the D.C. Council.
So there you have it. The challenge that we have as an industry is not coming from our consumers. Our consumers, we serve our consumers. We meet their needs and wants every day. You meet your consumers' needs and wants every day. The pressure for the change in the ownership model, which is the existential threat to dealers in this country, is going to come from government activity. And it's not going to be government activity in Washington. It's going to be government activity in the various cities and towns and counties around the country. So we need to be vigilant and need to support our associations so that we can push back on that. So where does this leave us all? Change is coming, but it's not going to be nearly as fast as most of the pundits predict and most of the hype that you've heard as you go from around to various consumer contracts. And that's largely because consumers remain at the center of the auto industry. Consumer interests need to be met. Consumer wants need to be met. When we meet them, we will win, and when we don't, we will lose. The new technologies aren't there yet, and only when they are there for consumer acceptance will they predominate. And finally, we need to keep a skeptical eye, particularly when we're talking with at our local governments. As I said, it won't be in Washington. When they try to accelerate these changes based on some of this hype without looking at the consumer interests like safety and consumer wants like freedom and flexibility. Thank you very much, and I hope you have a great convention.